Hello, I'm Aubrey Shepherd, but this is Joe Neal's show today. He's been here before, but today he wants to talk about a sensitive subject.
Well, the sensitive subject are seasonal wetlands. And these are wetlands not like the ones you see down on the Gulf Coast, but these are wetlands that exist in the Ozarks around Fayetteville. And if you're driving up Highway I-49 or along Highway 112, you're going through what's left of Fayetteville seasonal wetlands. And these are habitats that are full of rare and unusual plants and animals. And I think people would be shocked to realize when they're looking out over fields that look like they just have nothing but grass for cows, that they're actually full of unusual plants and animals. And I'm trying to drum up some support for giving them more protection, and when they're rezoned, to make sure that there's a mitigation plan in place that will guarantee that in Fayetteville, inappropriate habitats will still have these plants and animals.
Well, the federal government's talked about for years the no net loss of wetland, and yet it continues unabated. Tell us about some of the plants in particular that people will recognize there if they get a guidebook and walk out there and look at that land in the growing season. In the winter, they look pretty drab.
Well, if you went out there after there'd been rain, like in the spring, during the growing season when it warms up, and that land's allowed to grow, in other words, it's not cut or bulldozed or something, there are a whole bunch of rare small plants called sedges that are out there. And these are not great big flowering plants like rose bushes or something that everybody would recognize, but they're unusual in that they have unusual life cycles. There are a lot of them that are unusual. They're not well studied, and we know from botanical surveys all over Arkansas that the wetlands in northwest Arkansas, including this property, contains a whole lot of these species. And there are other plants that would be readily recognizable in places like that. For example, one's called swamp milkweed. And later in the year, in the summer, if they're allowed to grow up instead of being cut down, they'd be covered with these fantastic pink flowers, covered with monarch butterflies when the monarchs migrate through. The monarchs lay eggs on these plants, on swamp milkweed and other native milkweeds, and you could find monarch caterpillars on these plants. So if you're concerned about monarchs, for example, or other pollinating insects, that takes you back to the plants that they live on, and then that takes you back to the habitat where they grow, and that takes us right back to this subject about seasonal wetlands. Because as we lose the seasonal wetlands, we lose all of this.
Well, Joe, even the federal rules don't treat seasonal wetlands or wetland, I like to say it. I always say that wetlands are like Indonesia and so forth, but
or the Gulf Coast.
Wetland.
Yeah, wetland, yeah.
But anyway, it's the English major in me, but you were a history major before you were a biologist.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about, changes in life when you get really interested in things like the outdoors. Why is it that people have to see water standing? I mean, to recognize it. I mean, it's the characteristics of the soil, the absorbance.
Well, I'll tell you the best example I can give you, Aubrey. I bet you own a car, don't you?
Mm-mm.
And I own a car too. Well, you go to any auto mechanic, and I take my car in there, and I could just tell something's not quite right. And of course, the auto mechanics that I've been going to for years in Fayetteville, they look at me like, and you've got an education and you don't know what this problem is? And see, it's the same thing with these seasonal wetlands. We drive by them every day. We take it for granted, like our cars. We take it for granted they'll run, but then something goes wrong and they don't run right. this case, we're actually destroying these seasonal wetlands without even paying any attention to what lives there. And those things are really important to making Northwest Arkansas what it really is naturally. And especially in Fayetteville, that has a reputation for being a city that's proud of its natural heritage, that where we're trying to manage the city to be more in tune with the environment. We need to pay more attention to this stuff. We need to pay a lot more attention, and we don't need to wait on the federal government and the Army Corps of Engineers or the Arkansas Department of Environmental Quality to tell us that these lands are important and that they deserve some protection.
We've run out of time, but we could talk some more in a moment.
Okay.
Thank you. Hi, Joe. Go ahead and talk about the Illinois River watershed, where this land is that you're talking about.
Well, you know, like once again, if you're traveling up Highway 112 on the north side of Fayetteville or I-49 headed north, you're in the Clabber Creek watershed there, and these seasonal wetlands are all in that watershed. And maybe not so well known is the fact that that flows into the Illinois River. And so all that development that's going on in that area is in the Illinois River watershed. And Fayetteville very wisely committed itself and spent a lot of money to build a wastewater treatment plant to protect our discharge into the Illinois River. Eventually what goes into the Illinois River, a very wise thing to do. What I think would surprise a lot of people is that if you go over to Ten Killer Lake in Oklahoma, you're also in the Illinois River watershed. So if you go over there and see common loons over there in winter, like I do, what you're really seeing is one of the endpoints of what happens at Clabber Creek when you're traveling up through I-49, because that's where that water starts. So my point in all this is that we're connected to these things. And so it would make a lot of sense for us to look at this in a broad scale rather than, for example, just a small scale. For example, recent example, a large church is planned for that area along 112, and the city allowed that project to go forward. There was a little bit of mitigation done, but there were tons of gravel was hauled in there and covered most of the 26-acre site for an 800-car parking lot. And that's part of that watershed, which means that's been subtracted effectively from that watershed. And that's just one example. There are a lot of other projects that are going to go in there. And I feel like, and what I'd advocate for our planning process, including zoning, is that we look at the whole impact on what happens here. For example, if we're going to subtract one parcel after another from that watershed in that area, we need to look at all the plants and all the animals that we know occur in that habitat. For example, when the wastewater treatment plant was built on the west side of Fayetteville, there have been a series of studies at Woolsey Wet Prairie Sanctuary. And we now have a really good idea of what birds, what salamanders, what frogs, what crayfish, what snakes, and so forth actually live in that sort of habitat. And there's also been detailed botanical survey in there. And when they started that project out there, the thought was that there might be 50 or 60 species. I actually have the numbers here somewhere, I can't find it. But by the time they got done with the botanical surveys, they found out that there were more than 400 species in that area that at the start looks a lot like what's being developed in North Fayetteville. So my point and the bottom line is that what we're doing is we're making zoning decisions without playing with a full deck. In other words, people are doing what they feel like they need to do to move these processes forward, but we're not really looking carefully at the overall impacts on the watershed. And I've lived here in Fayetteville since the 1960s, long enough to know that I know that area is going to get developed. But why would we be willing to give up a huge amount of plant diversity and animal diversity in these habitats just because we were in a hurry to zone them in a way that's destructive. So that's my thought about it, that let's think about this holistically in the Fayetteville way. Holistically, let's look at all of it. And then we know that private landowners, and I couldn't agree more, have a right to use their land. But the whole people of Fayetteville, 75,000 of us, also have rights to the plants and animals that live in those ecosystems.
Well, Joe, we're about to run out of time, but I believe that it's partially just people don't know the importance of those things, and maybe we'll have some shows where you come back and talk about, you know, you're welcome here every week at public access like everybody else is. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks for listening.